Good evening. Good evening. How is everybody? My name is Anthony Curtis. I am the Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of the Nixon Foundation. It's an honor to be here and have the privilege of introducing such an acclaimed, talented, and charming biographer that is Edmund Morris. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Edmund Morris. Before you get to hear him speak, I've just got a couple of things. Now, I know that December just started. I haven't even started my Christmas shopping, but we've already got things to put in your January calendar. We hope that you would please join us for our annual event for Richard Nixon's birthday. It'll be January 9th. We do free admission the entire day. We'll start the day in the morning with a wreath laying out in the memorial sites, which is a very emotional, very strong, powerful ceremony. And at 1 o'clock, the annual Nixon Legacy Lecture will be given by General Don Hughes, who was military aide to both Vice President Richard Nixon and President Richard Nixon. And a funny little tidbit, he was also in Richard Nixon's younger brother, Ed Nixon's wedding. So he's a close friend of the family, and he's going to have tons of really good stories, and it's just going to be a great contribution to the Richard Nixon legacy, and we hope you all come out, and we'll entice you with free admission, so you have no excuse, okay? A couple weeks later, on January 20th, we've got another freebie for you. This one is put on in conjunction with KRLA and Salem Radio. This is a goodie, because our dear friend and our first executive director, Hugh Hewitt, will be here with Dick Morris, who is a favorite of ours, and we've pretty much had him every year, and he loves coming out to Yorba Linda. They'll be talking about the education system, the trials and tribulations, what needs to happen, how we can improve it, and it's free and open to the public, 7 o'clock, January 20th. Later that week, on January 25th, it's not a freebie, but it's still at 7 o'clock, we just booked Ronald Reagan's son, Michael Reagan, who will be here for his new book, The New Reagan Revolution, How Ronald Reagan's Principles Can Restore America's Greatness Today. Tickets are $29. For members, it's $27, and every ticket comes with a free book, which Michael will autograph and inscribe at the end of the event. So don't miss that one. Edmund Morris began his journey with Theodore Roosevelt after hearing Richard Nixon use moving words of Theodore Roosevelt's in a speech. After some research, he soon discovered that TR, and I'm quoting Edmund, TR may have been the most interesting man who ever lived. And that, coming from a guy like Edmund Morris, really is a compliment. More than 30 years ago, in the dusty attic and barns of the president's home, he sifted through a cache of valuable information. He commented that TR is a biographer's dream because he had an observant eye and ear, and a prodigious memory. He recorded so many details of everywhere he went, everything he did, and everything he said and thought. But what more can you expect from a president that wrote 40 books, hunted lions, founded a third political party, and survived an assassin's bullet? I mean, really, that's what you get. The first book in Edmund's Roosevelt trilogy, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, won him a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award in 1980. He later went on to write Theodore Rex, which was well-received and well-reviewed. And now the last book in the series, sure to be a bestseller, Colonel Roosevelt, which is also available in the museum store, is out now. Ladies and gentlemen, Edmund Morris.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. That's the most eloquent introductory address I've had since I appeared in Berkeley, California, to push my book on Ronald Reagan. And the guy who was supposed to introduce me ran out of courage at the last minute and ducked out the side door, so I had to introduce myself. I thought the hell with it, so I said, "Good evening, my fellow Republicans." And survived to tell the tale. Yes, it's quite true that Nixon, in his farewell speech to the White House staff, stimulated me to begin writing the life of Theodore Roosevelt. But I guess the seed of the future biography was implanted many years before that, 25 years before that, when I was a schoolboy in Kenya, and was, at the age of 10, was going through a period of infatuation with the United States because I had discovered in our downtown library a bunch of books by Mark Twain. In particular, Tom Sawyer, whom I identified with to such a passionate extent that I could hallucinate Tom Sawyer walking along the dirt road toward my house. And I very much wanted, at the age of 10, to quit the boring wilderness of Africa and come and live in the United States and be buddies with Tom Sawyer. So at that same age of 10, I happened to open, to be paging through Civic History of Nairobi, which my father must have bought, and came across this photograph of the famous American president who in 1909 had come to Kenya to shoot practically every living thing that walked on the African plains in behalf of the Smithsonian Institution. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, and the photograph, to a 10-year-old boy, was mysteriously exciting. He had a pith helmet on, and this mustache, and this grin, these teeth. He had so many teeth. I subsequently came across a line of Somerset Maugham in one of his Ashendon stories that I've always identified with TR. He had more teeth than seemed necessary for any practical purpose. So there was this mustache, there was these teeth, here was this American figure giving off waves of bonhomie. And I don't know, 10-year-old boy, I thought, he looks like fun. Kind of man I'd like to be with. Forgot about him, of course, in the course of childhood, and it was only 25 years later, as a recent immigrant to the United States, I'd been here 6 years, when Nixon resigned, and quoted some words that Theodore Roosevelt had written in his farewell speech to the White House staff. Nixon, I think, was talking about his mother at that point, and he began to weep and said, "I want to read some words of Theodore Roosevelt. There had never come to her any great sorrow. As a fair flower she lived, and as a fair flower she died." And he cried a bit, and I remember thinking, I don't know what this has to do with resigning the presidency, but what were the circumstances in which Theodore Roosevelt wrote those rather touching words? So I poked around in a library and I found that the circumstances were indeed very poignant. He had written them as a young man after the death of his beloved first wife, Alice Hathaway Lee. How's that for a name? Alice Hathaway Lee. After only 4 years of marriage, I found that she had died in this Manhattan brownstone that they shared on the same night, under the same roof as his own mother. And this double catastrophe impelled the young Theodore Roosevelt to give up his political career. He was already a New York State Assemblyman, to go west and become a ranchman and try to recover from grief, which he indeed did. And within the space of 2 years out west, ranching in the Dakotas, he built up his frail body into the familiar burly mechanism we know from 1,000 Caricatures. He repaired his soul. He wrote a few biographies, the first of his 40 books. And he came back in the spring of 1886 to marry his childhood sweetheart, Edith Kermit Caro, already quite conscious of the fact that he was a potential, if not a certain, future president of the United States. As he frequently said later on, if it hadn't been for my years in North Dakota, I never would have become president. I think the cathartic moment, and the one which appealed to me as a writer, was when he delivered the 4th of July oration in Dickinson, North Dakota, July 4th, 1886. A quintessentially Rooseveltian speech. I like big things, big America. Well, like all Americans, I like bigness. He went on in this vein for half an hour, and afterwards, after the speech and the fireworks were going off, the editor of the Badlands Cowboy newspaper went up to him and said, Theodore, if you keep talking like that, you're going to end up President of the United States. And TR was not abashed, didn't giggle, didn't laugh. He said, yes. And I think I will make a good one. This ability to remember his own future was a strange aspect of TR. It happened again and again. When he left Harvard, rotten with asthma, heart problems, nervous diarrhea, his doctor said to him, Theodore, you're going to have to live a sedentary life. And otherwise you're going to die early. And he said, Doctor, I'm going to do everything you counsel me not to. I'm going to live a resolute physical life. I'm going to climb mountains. I'm going to punch cattle. And I'm going to die at the age of 60, having lived life to the hilt. Again, he remembered his own future very accurately. He kept his promise, and he died at 60. By the way, this has got absolutely nothing to do with this book, but talking about remembering one's own future, Reagan had that too. I wrote a book about Reagan, Dutch, a memoir of Ronald Reagan. In the book, I reproduced an ink silhouette self-portrait that Reagan drew of himself, showing this big burly man with a pompadour hairstyle, sitting, dominating a large desk. Exactly what you saw when you walked into the Oval Office. I showed it to countless Reagan people. They all said, wow, the president. And I said, yes, but he drew this when he was 17 years old. If you look at a copy of Dutch, you'll see the picture. And Reagan, too, had this astonishing ability, not only in drawings, but in the essays and short stories he wrote as a student, to remember his future. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Nixon's speech, the anecdotes, the story, this nucleus of what seemed to be a fascinating human life, consumed me to the extent that I began to want to write a screenplay about him, about TR, which I in fact did. I wrote a speculative screenplay, hoping, like all young unemployed writers, that I could sell it to some network and make real money. And it was about those years out west, beginning with the death of Alice Lee and coming back after July 4th and marrying Edith. And I called it The Dude from New York, which indeed is what he was called in those days, the Eastern Dude. But of course, by 1976, when I wrote it, the word dude had begun to acquire different connotations. A producer did acquire it and announced in Variety magazine, we have acquired the rights to Edmund Morris's screenplay, The Dude from New York. And he was immediately inundated with hundreds of applications for the title role from out-of-work black actors who thought it was a hood movie, The Dude from New York. The rights are still available if anybody... So I wrote the screenplay, and my agent said to me, listen, if you've done this work, why did you write a short, popular biography of Theodore Roosevelt? It's time a new one was done. She said, I could probably get you $7,500 from a New York publisher. So I said, all right, I'll do that. So she got me $7,500 from Card McCann, which seemed like a fortune at the time, except it was payable in 4 installments. A 1 quarter on beginning of the project, 1 quarter on halfway through, the other quarter on delivery, and the final quarter, if I was still alive, on publication. Well, it took 4 years, and I don't know how we survived, but the book was published in 1979, and it succeeded, and I found myself saddled with what has turned out to be, I guess, a lifetime project. The book was The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. It ended with a superbly cinematic climax. TR had the gift of theatre to such a degree that not only did he behave dramatically all his life with the actor's gift of timing and of self-presentation and oratory and flamboyance. Apart from these theatrical gifts, theatrical, dramatic events happened to him. He attracted drama. Any other vice president of the United States, hearing that the president had been assassinated, would have been sitting at his desk or at home or somewhere in Washington. But TR had to be on the summit of Mount Marcy, the highest point of New York State, silhouetted against the sky, as this ranger came running up through the trees with a telegram. And as soon as he saw the telegram, as he wrote in his own autobiography, I knew what message the man was bringing. No writer could go beyond such a magnificent cliffhanger as that. So that's where the first book ended, with the messenger running up through the trees with the telegram. So it was quite obvious to me that it would have to be followed by a book about the presidency, the full 2 terms, 1901 to 1909. And it was equally obvious to me early on that it would be a trilogy in which TR's fabulous post-presidential life, 1909 to 1919, would be the capstone of the trilogy. So here I am 30 years later, having finished it, and it may seem an enormous amount of time to devote to one president, to which I can only say that he was such a superabundant personality that 30 years is really not enough. And also, to be absolutely accurate about it, I did devote 15 of those 30 years to Ronald Reagan. So TR was not part of the scene for that half of the 30 years. And I also wrote a short book about Beethoven, which took me a year and a half. So really, each of the Roosevelt books has taken no more than about 4.5 years, which by biographical standards is quite quick. Nevertheless, I began writing about him 30 years ago, and it's now done. It was not easy to switch from the early chapters of Theodore Rex, the presidential volume, in the early 1980s and begin to write about Reagan, but the opportunity to write about Reagan was so irresistible that I had to do it. And at first it was difficult sitting in the White House at frequently boring meetings. One of the unwritten secrets of the White House is the life of the president is often extremely boring. Grips and grins and turkey blessings and diplomatic receptions. I found myself doodling paragraphs of Theodore Rex on a yellow legal pad during these sterile periods, and once I doodled a few paragraphs and forgot about them. And I was walking off down the corridor toward the Oval Office, and one of the secretaries came running after me. "Mr. Morris, you left your notes." I said, "Oh, thank you," and she gave them to me. She said, "Sir, you ought to be more careful about national security." I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, it says here the president's plotting an invasion of Panama." So I realized then no man can serve two masters, and from then onwards I concentrated on Reagan. All right, 1909. 3 weeks after leaving the White House. The youngest president we've ever had, 50 years old still, full of power, full of potential, full of vigor for life, Theodore Roosevelt found himself sitting on the cowcatcher of a Uganda Railroad locomotive, chugging up from Mombasa up into the highlands of Kenya, 3 weeks after leaving the White House, to embark on this massive safari for the Smithsonian Institution, which was going to occupy him for another year, more than a year. His specific purpose in leaving the United States was to remove the distraction of his gigantic personality from the political scene to make things easier for President Taft, his hand-picked Republican successor. TR knew if he stayed, with his flamboyance, his stature, his irresistible appeal to the press, that Taft would be unable to function effectively. So off he went to Africa and began this massive safari. The story of the safari is the story of the prologue to Colonel Roosevelt. Why is it called Colonel Roosevelt? Because, having left the White House, the newsmen said to him, started addressing him as Mr. President. He said, "No, absolutely not. I'm no longer president." So they said, "Well, what do we call you?" And he said, "Well, Colonel Roosevelt would please me," because he felt that this title of colonel had been earned in battle, had been legitimately earned in the Spanish-American War when he led the famous Rough Rider charge up the heights of San Juan. He felt it was a title which was his for life, whereas president was a title that was his only for 7.5 years. He believed that supreme power was finite. It was the gift of the people, vouchsafed to him in 1901, given back to the people when he handed over to Taft, and was no longer his title to enjoy, which made it all the more poignant when he finally came back to America after his more than a year abroad, had a reunion with Taft, the summer White House up in Beverly, Massachusetts, and Taft started calling him Mr. President. And he kept saying, "No, you must not call me that. You are president now." But Taft couldn't stop doing it because Taft actually did feel he was still president of the United States. During this year away, he found to his astonishment, when he came down the Nile in the spring of 1910, that the year he had spent in almost total obscurity in the highlands of Africa, out of touch with world events, with news, he found to his amazement that he had become so celebrated in absentia that when he came down the Nile, Khartoum was full of correspondents from all around the world wanting to interview him about his coming return to the United States, and was he going to run for president again? Other questions of that, so what's he going to do about President Taft's inability to function effectively? And also, he came back to, in Khartoum, the stack of embossed invitations from all the kings and emperors of Europe to come and visit their countries and stay in their palaces and address their universities. The King of Italy, the Emperor of Austria and Hungary, the President of France, the King of Belgium and of Holland, the Queen of Holland, all the kings of Scandinavia, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Edward VII in Britain. They all wanted him to come and stay because they all believed he was going to go back to the United States and become president again. So willy-nilly, he embarked upon a grand tour of Europe, which was so spectacular that it was no euphemism, no exaggeration to acknowledge the fact that he had become the most famous man in the world. He ended up on the field of Doberitz in Germany in early May of 1910, sitting on a grey charger next to the Kaiser. There's a photograph in the book of the two of them together, watching the German army at its military exercises. And when he came back home that night, back to his rooms in Berlin, he said to his wife, deeply depressed, he said, "What I have seen today convinces me we're in for it. A gigantic war is coming." It wasn't quite his sole apprehension. All the potentates he stayed with, all these kings and emperors, were aware that a catastrophe was coming. But TR, being a representative of the neutral United States, understood it perhaps more in the round than any of these kings and queens. It so happened, again, to him who is theatrical, theatre shall happen, it so happened that King Edward died while TR was in Germany, and he found himself appointed special representative, special ambassador of the United States by President Taft to represent the United States at the funeral of King Edward. So it was that on that beautiful spring day of May 1910, TR in his black American Republican clothes marched down Whitehall amongst all the carriages and the jiggling epaulettes and the flashing orders and the busbies and the panoply of imperial power, surrounded by all these crowned heads who within a few short years were going to be at each other's throats, very few of whom would survive the Great War. When he came back after that, arriving in New York Harbor in June of 1910, he was given the biggest welcome home that any New Yorker, any American had ever received. More than 1 million people turned out and lined Broadway and Fifth Avenue to welcome Teddy back. And it was pretty well universally felt at that time that he was the once and future president, coming back like Napoleon from Elba to reclaim the power of the country. But he was quite determined to stay out of politics. He wanted to go into a literary retirement and write books, spend the rest of his life as a man of letters. And a large part of the story of the first half of this book is the story of his unavoidable draft back into political life. I won't get into the complexities of it. I will only say that by November of 1910, he was deep back into party politics, campaigning the country. This is exactly 100 years ago, November of 1910, campaigning the country in behalf of congressional candidates of the progressive persuasion. Progressive Republicans, small p, progressive. Actually, it happened that was an unfortunate campaign for him because somehow the sight of this great former president, reduced to giving testimonial speeches for candidates around the country, was demeaning and surprising and anticlimactic to the American people. So his reputation and prestige tumbled along with the fact that that was a terrible election for the Republican Party, those midterm congressional elections of 1910. And it became more and more obvious that the Democratic Party, in 2 years' time, was going to have a sweep, ending the long dominance by the GOP of American political affairs. So TR, from the heights of world fame in the spring of 1910, was plunged into the depths of political obscurity after that election. He spent the next year writing astonishingly erudite essays for Outlook magazine, quite unaffected by his political fall. He was relieved to be out of politics. And I must say the major surprise to me in writing this book has been to discover from reading these essays that he wrote in 1911 and the early part of 1912, it was to discover how deep his erudition was. I'd always known it to be broad. I'd always known he wrote 40 books of military history, biography, Western history and naval history, political commentary, literary essays. I'd always known he had an enormously broad mind, a universal understanding. He was a paleontologist and an ornithologist and a natural historian. But I didn't realize how deep his mind was until I read these essays. Just to give you one example, one of them was called The Search for Truth in a Reverent Spirit. A long, long essay on the conflict between evolutionary biology and religion. Exactly the ideological conflict that has been a hot topic here in the United States in recent years. In the course of writing this essay, he cited books written in 3 or 4 languages by an astonishing variety of theologians and scientists and evolutionary experts. And the sheer breadth of knowledge, so effortlessly tossed off in the course of this essay by somebody who had been a 2-term president of the United States, is truly remarkable. Let alone the essays he also wrote that year about the differences between medieval imagery and 20th century imagery, concealing and revealing coloration in animals, all these subjects coming out of this prodigiously fertile mind. Can you imagine any other president or former president showing up at the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, as he did in early 1910, the oldest university in the world, and saying to the mullahs as they squatted teaching madras to their Islamic students, "Do you have in your library a scroll of the travels of Ibn Battuta, the well-known medieval Arab traveler?" The mullahs couldn't believe what they were hearing. They scuttered off to their library, came back with the scroll of Arabic script. This is a classic of Arabic literature, but here's a former president asking for it. And while they were fetching it for him, TR began to recite the early pages of this book and said, "I didn't read it in Arabic, you understand, but I did read it in French a number of years ago, and I've never forgotten." I can't quite imagine any of TR's predecessors or successors being able to get away with that kind of multiculturalism. He did it again and again throughout his life, and that's why it's such a delight for a biographer to be able to write about a man like this, who was not just a politician. He was a Renaissance man in the truest sense. However, there burned in his breast the ambitions and the passions of a political ideologue. That was a large part of him. He had decided when he left Harvard that he did not want to be a natural historian or an academic. He did want to be a practical politician. So that fire still burned in his breast or perhaps in his belly, which is why in 1912 he was plucked out of obscurity, out of political retirement, I should say, by these still passionate progressives wanting him to run for the GOP nomination in 1912, which he, with extreme reluctance, did. Extreme reluctance balanced by an uncontrollable desire for power. He admitted to it. Paradoxical, but large men, large characters, often contain paradoxes in their bosoms. He did not want to get back into politics. He did want to be president again. So he ran. He ran against President Taft. Only half the states in those days had primaries. All the primaries went overwhelmingly in favor of Theodore Roosevelt. But the mechanism of the party was still so strong that the orthodox states, where delegates were still selected by the party mechanism, made the renomination of President Taft inevitable, and TR then was forced to bolt the Republican Party and form the Progressive Party with a capital P that subsequently became known as the Bull Moose Party. the most famous and successful third-party candidacy in our history, even though he was defeated, as he knew he would be, in the election of 1912. It was inevitable he would be, because he'd split the Republican Party in half by taking all the progressives with him, therefore enabling the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to be elected on a minority vote. Even though he knew it was a quixotic campaign, it was a supremely impressive campaign. He came in second, humiliating the sitting President of the United States, who came in third. And it was marked, of course, by a supreme piece of theater, such as only Theodore Roosevelt could carry off. On October the 14th of that year, he was campaigning in Milwaukee. It had been a long day. His high, harsh, falsetto voice was strained. But he insisted on committing to the speech, on giving the speech he was committed to after dinner that night at the Milwaukee Auditorium. So he checked into a hotel, the Gilpatrick Hotel, for dinner, and shortly before 8 o'clock came down the stairs, surrounded by his Secret Service guys and a couple of Progressive Party men. And outside the hotel, a limousine was waiting, an open 7-seat car. A small crowd was collected around it in the street, cordoned off. And as he climbed into his limo, the crowd began to cheer. By the way, there are all sorts of uncanny similarities to this story between this and the attack on Ronald Reagan in March of 1981. That also took place outside a hotel, a waiting limousine. So, also a presidential wave. TR raised his hand to acknowledge the cheers of the crowd, and as he did so, a short, blonde, dull-eyed young man stepped forward and let off a bullet which, at almost point-blank range, which smacked into TR's overcoat on the right side, went through the heavy overcoat, went through his jacket, went through his vest, went through his speech, which was a 50-page speech, folded double, which makes 100 pages, on thick paper, went through that, went through his steel-lined spectacle case, went through his skin and smacked into a rib, just a fraction of an inch away from his heart, and stopped there. If it hadn't been for those impedimenta, he'd have been dead before he sat down. The young man was wrestled to the ground by the Secret Service people, and one of them was in hysteria trying to break the guy's neck in a half Nelson. TR shouted out, "Don't hurt him, bring him here." They brought this person, John Schrank was his name, an unemployed tavern keeper from New York City. Brought him to the edge of the limo, and TR took his head in his hands in an oddly tender gesture, looked into his face and said, "Why did you do it?" And as he said that, he looked and he saw these dull eyes. He realized he was holding the face of a completely crazy person. And he said, "Oh, take him away." So the police bundled Schrank off, and to the stupefaction of TR's companions, he said, "I want to deliver my speech." They said, "You've been shot." He said, "Well, he pinked me. He pinked me." Would not go to hospital, went to the Milwaukee Auditorium. One of his representatives stepped out on the stage and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Roosevelt has been shot, but he's well and he wants to speak to you tonight." Which sort of got their attention. He marched out looking rather tottery with his face grey and took from his pocket the folded speech, which you will see a photograph. There's a photograph of it in the book. As he unfolded it, he saw the perforations. And that shook him. it was as though it was, I suppose, delayed recognition of the fact he had been shot. He had a bullet in his chest. So he reeled a bit at the sight of the speech, but he began to declaim it and noticed dampness in his shirt front, realized he was bleeding, so he opened his coat, and exposed the spreading bloodstain, and shrieked in his soprano voice, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose!" You may laugh, but there's a lot of very weird Christian symbolism here. This unique thing about the Progressive Party and its convention in particular was how evangelical it was. They kept singing "Onward, Christian soldiers," and "The Lord is King," and these endless prayers and religious invocations. TR was not a particularly devout person. He could thump the Bible when he had to in political speeches, but he was not spiritual by nature. And the religious imagery of the Progressive Convention somewhat embarrassed him, but he had to go along with it. So here is he a few months later. "This is my body, which is broken for you. This is my blood." I'm sure he was not particularly conscious of this irony, but as his biographer, I cannot avoid noticing the irony of what happened to him and the histrionics with which he displayed his blood. Naturally, it won him an enormous popular vote of sympathy, and naturally he recovered, carried the bullet in his chest for the rest of his life. And equally naturally, he was defeated. So that's the end of that particular drama, but he went on to others, being TR. A year later, he was in the jungles of the Amazon, exploring a tributary of the Amazon, an unknown river, the Rio de Duvida, which was longer than the Rhine, almost 1,000 miles long, nearly dying in the process of a combination of abscesses and malaria and heart trouble. In fact, being so prostrated that he begged to be left to die and not hamper the expedition anymore. This was a joint American-Brazilian expedition. However, of course, they wouldn't leave him, and they brought him back to civilization. There is a rather touching photograph in Colonel Roosevelt of TR standing looking very skeletal and frail in the lower reaches of this river on the day that his Brazilian counterpart, Colonel Cândido Rondon, baptized the river in his name, baptizing it as the Rio Roosevelt, which is still its name to this day, except the Brazilians have trouble saying Roosevelt, so they call it the Rio Teodoro, Teddy's River. He came back from that expedition looking pretty dreadful in the spring of 1914, and had his first audience with Woodrow Wilson in the White House. A meeting that has escaped the notice of previous historians, I'm proud to say. It's one of my few original discoveries in the course of this book. It's always been assumed that TR did not have an audience with Wilson until May of 1917, when the United States was already committed to war. No, he was there in May of 1914. And that is when, after they'd sat together having lemonade on the portico, and TR had gone off waving his hat at a bunch of children and bumping his hat on the head of a little boy with a copy of Penrod sticking out of his pocket, boy's book. That was when Woodrow Wilson said to his secretary, "He's just like a great big boy. You cannot resist the man. There's a sweetness about him that is palpable." But from that moment onward, their relationship deteriorated, because it became apparent to TR, particularly after the Lusitania was sunk in May of 1915, that great war raging in Europe was a war against democracy. It was German militarism, fascism in embryo, against the democratic freedoms of Europe. What particularly disturbed him, apart from the sinking of the Lusitania, was the destruction of the great cathedral at Reims and the destruction of the University of Louvain in Belgium, the greatest medieval library in the world, by the Germans in deliberate act of psychological terrorism. These three things, the Lusitania, Louvain, and destruction of Reims, so violated Theodore Roosevelt's notion of civilized priorities that from that moment on he was passionately anxious and ardent for the United States to get involved in this war and save democracy. Wilson, as we all know, was a pacifist and a neutralist who had absolutely no comprehension of foreign cultures whatsoever. I don't think he spoke any foreign languages. His idea of a foreign excursion was vacation in Bermuda. And he was determined to keep the United States out of what he regarded as a foreign war. And it was only by the spring of 1917, when the Germans were routinely sinking our neutral shipping, that the United States was finally obliged to go to war, and the rest is history. TR's final tragedy, the reason this book does achieve, or should I say, the reason his life does achieve a tragic dimension, was the fact that he, in his declining years, longed to be able to lead a division of American volunteer soldiers to that war. He wanted to be a major general and to fight in battle and die gloriously. All his boyhood romanticism, all his romantic memories of the Spanish-American War came surging up, and he begged Wilson and Wilson's Secretary of War time and time again to let him do this. The old story of the sadist and the masochist. The masochist said, "Beat me, beat me." And the sadist said, "No, I won't." I always think of that when I think of Wilson saying to him in May 1917, "No, you can't. No, you can't go abroad. You cannot." Although Wilson was right. TR was then in his late 50s. His health was shot. Warfare was no longer cavalry charges. It was brutal, mechanized, universal. It would have been a catastrophe for TR to imagine that he could have led a division of amateur volunteer soldiers to that war. Wilson was absolutely right, but that didn't alter the fact that TR was devastated not to be able to serve. So he spent his last 2 years putting all his hopes in his 4 sons, who all went to the Western Front, that they would achieve the honor that he had been denied. And I must say, there's an element of sickness in his quite palpable, in fact, sometimes articulated, hope that one or more or all of these boys would be wounded and that perhaps killed and bring honor to the Roosevelt family name. So Quentin, the youngest and the brightest, the one most like himself, obliged and got killed in July of 1918. He was a fighter pilot who was shot down in a dogfight. And the shock of that death upon his father brought about a psychological and physical decline which more or less mandated his death just a few months later, on January the 6th, 1919. Now, there's a photograph in the book, in that chapter describing Quentin's death, which has never been reproduced before. The family have kept it have kept it out of circulation for almost 100 years. It shows Quentin lying beside his plane, his wrecked plane, just taken by the Germans, after they'd gone through his wallet and found that he'd seen the name Roosevelt and realized who he was. So they took this propaganda photograph of the dead boy lying by the plane, looking like a steer fallen off a hook in an abattoir. The brutality of this fact, the cold fact of death, was what destroyed in an instant all Theodore Roosevelt's notions of romance in battle and contributed to the pathos of his last days. After he died, and this is now the subject of the epilogue to this book, his stature was gigantic. He died at the age of 60, and had he lived until 1920, without question, he would have been renominated by the Republican Party for the presidency, and equally without question, he would have been elected in the Republican landslide of that year, which instead gave us President Harding. So there's a tragic dimension to the fact that all this was denied him, and one of the great what-ifs of history is what would have happened, how would life have been different if Theodore Roosevelt had survived to become president again in 1920. I must say I'm grateful to him for not surviving, because that would have necessitated a fourth volume, and 3 is quite enough. I killed him off with the greatest delight in January of this year. Wrote the epilogue, which traces the course of his post-presidential reputation. I won't go on too much longer because it's getting late, but he was regarded for the decade after his death as the third greatest of our presidents after George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. But in 1930, when an iconoclastic biography by Henry Pringle was published of him, his reputation went into a sudden, precipitous decline and remained pretty low throughout the 30s and 40s, began a slow reassessment and rise in the 50s, round about the time of the centennial of his birth in 1958. And from then on has very steadily risen, to the point that in the 1970s, when I began writing, the professors of history were saying to each other, sell Wilson and buy Theodore Roosevelt. And in all the latest surveys, he tends to come in regularly at number 4 after Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Franklin Roosevelt. So he now stands at 1 notch lower than he stood after his death, and I think that stature is deserved. Insofar as these books have been successful, I must say that he's entitled to 50% of the credit in alphabetical order. Thank you.
Now we have some time for some questions, so if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll come around with the microphone. Does anybody have any questions? Questions? Oh, we've got some time for some questions. Sorry, my mic's broken. If you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get the mic thing situated and we'll come around with it. Sir?
Or just shout, I can hear.
Okay.
Yes, sir?
I just want to ask you a question. With his very active life going all over the world, being president of the United States, he did father 6 children. How much time did he actually spend with them? That's the question I always wondered. He had 6 kids, something like that, and he was always doing something.
How much time did he spend with his 6 children? Amazingly, plenty. He was by nature a father. He adored his own children. He adored children, period. He couldn't resist babies. And to him, it was his wife, Edith, said, I have 7 children, and Theodore's the worst and naughtiest of the lot. One of his best friends, when he was president, said, one thing you must understand about the president is he's about 6 years old. So a man of that temperament is a delight to children. I guess it's what I responded to when I was a boy. He just was boyish. He loved his children and encouraged them to come up to grow up as rounded adults. They all adored him and hungered for more of him, as the children of presidents tend to do. And they went on in their various ways to various degrees of distinction. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. became the most decorated officer who's ever served in the 2 world wars. He came back from World War I with a chest full of medals. He went back to World War II as a general, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He participated in the D-Day landings, and he fought with such wild courage over those next few days that he won the Medal of Honor. And before he could receive it, he died of a heart attack. And General Patton said that he was one of the bravest soldiers he'd ever known. So Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was very much his father's son. Kermit killed himself. Alice became the famous Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Archie was a complicated and damaged personality whom you can read about in the epilogue. And Ethel became a Republican dowager who used to stand up at parties, even in the late 1980s, shouting, "Americanism, Americanism."
Yes, I'm in the process of reading Theodore Rex right now, and I wonder why you titled it Theodore Rex.
Why did I call Theodore Rex? Well, it's a phrase from Henry James, oddly enough, who was entertained to dinner at one of these literary banquets that TR liked to hold in 1905. And after watching the president in action, holding forth with scientists and courtiers and socialites, he wrote in a letter to one of his friends, "Theodore Rex is distinctly trying to establish a court." He thought there was something monarchical about TR. So when I saw that phrase, I thought, Theodore Rex, that's neat. It's a perfect title for this book, which is about a man in the plenitude of his powers exercising a kingly delight in power. Yes, sir?
Yes. What prompted Theodore Roosevelt to forfeit everything he had going on and what was happening at the time and join in the Spanish-American War and form a volunteer cavalry? What prompts somebody to do that?
What prompted TR to quit the job of Assistant Secretary of the Navy and join in the war? Well, he'd done a lot to bring the war about. He wanted to get Spain the hell out of Cuba and have the Western Hemisphere inhabited and controlled by North and South Americans. It was the last vestige of European empire in the Western Hemisphere. So he went and fought for the liberation of Cuba on idealistic grounds, but also because of this romantic love of battle. He couldn't resist the chance to fight, to charge. It's a rather nice parallel, by the way, which I discovered only in the course of writing the book, that Winston Churchill, who's often compared to TR for his breadth of interests and abilities, that Winston Churchill, that same summer of 1898, also participated in a historic cavalry charge at Omdurman in the British River War. Wrote a best-selling book about it, just as Theodore Roosevelt wrote a best-selling book about his charge, and that's when their relationship began to develop. A relationship which was extremely hostile on TR's side. He didn't like Churchill. Churchill came to visit him when he was governor of New York State and stayed with him in Albany. And TR took a violent dislike to him, and when he was asked about it afterwards, he said, because Churchill is not a gentleman. When the ladies came down for dinner, he stayed in his chair smoking a cigar and didn't stand up. He is vulgar, he is not a gentleman, and I want nothing more to do with him. There's a long footnote about the relationship between Winston Churchill and TR in this book. I won't go into the details, but it's kind of amusing. Yes?
Could a personality like Theodore Roosevelt exist in today's political climate, or would he be even allowed to get there because he's so opinionated, would he even be happy in these times?
Your guess is as good as mine, sir. Would a personality as explosive as that, as eccentric and flamboyant, prevail in our current politics? Well, he certainly would seem transcendently strange on television. Television likes cool, monochromatic personalities. So I think he would just be too much for many people. But we do hunger for that kind of certainty and that kind of subtlety that he had. And throughout our history, we have needed presidents at particular points, and we usually get the president we deserve. So I do not doubt that the United States will once again precipitate a president of that quality. In time, it'll happen. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am?
I just wondered, what was it about the biography in the 1930s that caused the decline in his popularity?
Oh, the biography that caused the decline in his popularity. Well, it was brilliantly written. Theodore Roosevelt, a biography by Henry Pringle. It got the Pulitzer Prize. It was funny. It didn't take him seriously. It mocked his antics on horseback. It portrayed him as an overgrown adolescent. It appeared at a time when militarism was repulsive to the post-World War I generation. So everything about that book contributed to the effectiveness of the destruction of TR's reputation. He was ready for such a decline. All great controversial figures need to go into a period of decline after their death, and that was his. If you read that book now, it's still delightful to read and often very funny, but you can see its superficiality. And when you read his letters, TR's letters, and read things like this essay on evolutionary biology I told you about, you begin to realize the stature of the man, and you begin to understand why his reputation has seriously come back to where it stands now. Yes, sir.
Given his friendship with Henry Cabot Lodge, and yet his progressive views, how do you think he would have felt about the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations?
Actually, he was not. He was consulted on his deathbed about the League of Nations by Henry Cabot Lodge and other friends, and he was not as critical of it as they were. All he required of the League of Nations was that if it came about, it should allow great powers like the United States to police their own security when they wanted to, and not be compelled by a concert of smaller powers to do things that were not in the country's interests. So he had a qualified approval of the idea of a peacekeeping organization, but what was paramount to him was that the United States should reserve its final decisions about its own security and foreign policy unto itself.
Oh, right here. Could you elaborate on the change in Theodore's worldview after Quentin's death? Was it just the romantic aspect of war that changed, or was there more than that?
There was not much more that he could or did say, because after that he went into such rapid decline. He was taken into hospital on the day of the armistice, November 11th. And all he said about the death of Quentin was in an essay called The Great Adventure, which he published. It's a very moving tribute to all the young men who were dying in Europe. Begins magnificently. Only those who fear to die are ready for the great adventure. Only those who do not fear to die are ready for the great adventure of life. But I'm sorry to say that after the magnificent opening paragraphs, it begins to get rather maudlin and develops into a saccharine Victorian prose poem, which is rather embarrassing to read now. And what it tells you is that he was as bewildered by death and by warfare as any other man would have been, and could not articulate his real feelings.
I have a question about you as the biographer. You're writing on Theodore Roosevelt for, well, we're at 30 years now, and certainly in the last several years, many books have come out. And as you're preparing any volume, and now the last volume, and like the Wilderness Warrior book came out as well, are you reading other biographies? Are you staying away from whatever else is being written so that you can keep your original ideas? And I'm sort of curious, as a biographer, how do you take in the writings of about Theodore that are coming out at the same time?
I try not to read them. I based my books on the documents, the letters, the 150,000 letters he wrote, his own books, his own speeches. the authentic records of people who knew him and wrote about him and spoke, and primary witnesses. To read secondary books by other writers is, I'm really not interested. I prefer to form my own judgments and to keep the material fresh. Sometimes after I've written a book, I'll look at secondary literature, but usually without too much regret. Occasionally I'll find something that I wish I had known, but it doesn't happen very often.
Besides writing the source material, will you be involved in the development of the Martin Scorsese adaptation of The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen, sir. Martin Scorsese was the Rise of Theodore Roosevelt has been under option by Paramount and various other production companies for quite some time, and Martin Scorsese was slated to direct it. And Leonardo DiCaprio was going to play TR, so I got very excited, as any author would be. But Hollywood is Hollywood, and Scorsese lost interest after a couple of years. It's now being touted by the director Taylor Hackford, who got the Oscar for Ray a few years back, Officer and a Gentleman. And according to the producers, it's going to be his next movie, but I'll believe it when I see it. Thank you, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, copies of Colonel Roosevelt are available in the museum store. Also, the first two in the trilogy that he spoke about are available also. He'll sign all of them. Thank you very much.